Collectively, African economies are responsible for barely 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions. But this continent arguably is the hardest hit by a lot more adverse weather. East Africa, for example, has swung from its worst drought in 40 years in 2022 to floods today, which have displaced over 700,000 people across Ethiopia, Kenya and Somalia. It's across a continent that's home to countries with vast natural gas reserves, from Libya up north to Nigeria in the west, Mozambique and Tanzania here in the east. Even with those resources, over 600 million people still do not have electricity from the national grid. So given all these factors we've just mentioned, what does a just transition away from oil and gas look like for African economies? And is it even a fair request to make when the capital to make that move is barely available? That's where my conversation with Kola Karim, the Group Managing Director of Shoreline Energy, began.
Africa today is only emitting under 3% of global emissions. Why is the world trying to hold us to the same global norms at the same time? That is unfair, and African leadership needs to stand tall, stand firm in trying to negotiate a just position for African countries and African nations.
So let's talk about what that looks like in detail then, because granted, I take the argument that, look, we're on a continent where 600 million Africans do not have access to power from the grid, right? There's fiscal considerations for petrostates like Angola, Equatorial Guinea, Nigeria as well. But you know, at some point, if you're going to say, okay, you want us to give up our oil and gas assets, fair enough. Where's the capital to essentially replace, right, to cover the opportunity cost that comes along with giving up these oil and gas assets, given that we have all these other obligations that we have to our citizens?
It should be a dual-pronged approach, right? If you look at most of the people in the frontal push of net zero, reality is we all are very considerate about the earth and the earth positioning. But what is important is if you think back, they have gone through and approaching their fourth industrial revolution. Most of the African countries we're talking about have not even had their first industrial revolution. So there is a fundamental flaw, and that mismatch has got to bridge itself. Two, financing on the continent of Africa. We've got 600 million people. We need to connect to some form of electricity, energy sufficiency on the continent. 600 million to connect, there's a lot of money. But today, even with our under 3% of emission, the cost of borrowing to doing projects in Africa is way more expensive. So where is the benefit to the African?
Because Western climate financing, going by all the promises, and I looked this up just before I actually came on air, that promise of delivering $100 billion a year in climate financing to countries like ours, right, Nigeria, Kenya, essentially countries in Africa, that was made at COP16 in Cancun, in Mexico. We're at COP28, and yet that money still isn't flowing. So can we do this by ourselves, by African countries essentially looking to the resources they have and saying, look, there's no foreign capital that's going to come in and rescue us here. We have to find the resources to do this ourselves. From where you sit as a business leader, is it feasible?
It is very feasible. Look, talk is cheap. It's easy to soundbite. We're going to put 100 billion, 300 billion. We've heard it, we've not seen it. How much changes have been made?
I want to wrap up by asking you about this conversation that we have around carbon credits and building carbon credit markets that sort of work. Because, you know, you and I have flown across the continent several times. You go into Cameroon, you go into Togo, Ghana, Nigeria as well. It's green, right, across the board. You've got these massive rainforests that are essentially providing a net public good by acting as a carbon sink to the world, and yet these countries are not being compensated for this public good that effectively they're providing to the rest of the planet. How do we change that model?
The model is very simple. Again, I start with leadership. You just explained it. Why on earth am I only responsible for 3% of the pollution, and yet I get penalized to borrowing money in a more expensive structure compared to the countries that are leading the charge on pollution? How do you explain that? You can't explain it. So reality is we need to be compensated And that compensation should come because of our low emission scale as we are today, should be a credit.
Let's go into a bit more detail there. How would that work exactly? If, say, for example, just hypothetically, Nigeria goes into the market and says, look, I want to raise $1 billion through a Eurobond. The market would come back and say, probably, yeah, we're willing to invest in this, but we're going to offer you a coupon rate of, say, 10%. How then do we turn Nigeria's environmental services, right, the carbon offsets that it's providing as a net public good, to essentially bring down that cost of capital?
That's very simple. By using global evaluation structures in evaluating all the green areas left in the country, left untouched, with a timeline, time bar position, in making sure that then becomes a credit. And by so doing, help to elevate the pricing of 10% to about 3 or 4%. So what you're doing is you're encouraging countries that are not encouraging deforestation, that are keeping areas green, encouraging them by making their cost of capital cheaper than the big polluters out there. So that way, we could then pour that capital that's now coming to us cheaper to energizing global growth within our economies. That's when we see an equalized growth in the long term.